Today I'm going to show you how to start adding watercolor techniques to your project, and as you can see, I've started to make some progress on my own piece. I do have a couple things next to me. So the first thing is my watercolor techniques worksheet. This is something that I'm going to glue into my sketchbook now that it's dry. So I've got all my techniques listed that we practiced earlier for this unit, and your goal for this project is going to be to use at least 3 of these in your artwork, okay? So my plan is to use wet on dry, wet on wet, maybe a little bit of dry brush, and salt painting in my background, okay? I'm also going to be using some value scales or gradients, so you guys can see I'm using a lot more than just 3, and it's pretty easy to use more than 3. So 3 is the requirement. Let me show you what I'm going to do, okay? I also have next to me my water and my brushes, and I have 2 different types of watercolor trays, so you just use whatever you have available to you at home. What I'm going to do is I've already painted most of my flowers, but I wanted to show you this last flower, what I was going to do with it. I already outlined it with analogous colors, and now as I'm painting, I'm starting to think about a different color scheme, complementary colors. Complementary colors are opposite from each other on the color wheel, and they make each other pop. They make each other look better. So you can see that I've already used some of my oranges and yellows in this flower, and that's going to really pop against the blues and violets I use in this flower. The reds and pinks that I've used in these flowers are really standing out against the greens of all the stems and the leaves. So let's get to work. I'm going to start by taking a little bit of water on my brush, and I'm going to try a little bit of a wet on wet technique. So wet on wet, remember, means wet water or wet paper, and putting wet paint on top of it. So I'm going to mix some purple, violet, and you can see it starts to just automatically bleed. Now, what you don't want to do with watercolors is you don't want to really work into your paper too much, because if you do, it's going to start pilling and falling apart. So just let the watercolors do their thing, is what I always tell my students. I'm going to take a dark blue and kind of mix that into it too. That looks really pretty. And what that does is it makes a blue-violet. Okay, so I'm going to kind of brush that into there. And then I think what I'm going to do is just take some regular water and kind of pull the rest of the paint down. Now I like what it's doing down here, where it's getting a little bit darker towards the end of the petal. That's making it look a little bit more three-dimensional. And for right now, I'm just going to let it rest. I'm going to let it do its thing. Now I'm going to start working on my other petal, and for this one, I'm going to use a wet on dry technique. So I'm going to start with wet paint on dry paper. And I think I need to add a little bit of violet to that. Now you might have noticed I just dropped a little bit of paint on my paper. I also have a tissue next to me. That's so that I can blot up if any of my paint starts to spread, or maybe there's a little bit too much moisture on your paper. The tissue helps you a lot with making sure that you end up with a painting that doesn't get too messy. So I'm going to use this. I think I'm going to put a little more violet down here. And then I'm going to take water, again, just like I did before. It still has a little bit of pigment on my brush, but you can see because it's mostly water, it's becoming a lot lighter. Now, like I said, if it's getting a little bit too wet, just dab a tissue, or even a piece of toilet paper works really well, and it absorbs anything extra. So now I'm just going to take my clean brush and use that. Now, oddly enough, what I'm also using is my wax resist, right? That technique of using wax or oil pastel to resist the paint, because again, this has oil in it, the oil pastel lines, but the water is resisting that, and so that's why the oil pastel is really showing through in my painting. All right, I'm gonna paint this petal. I think for this one, I'm gonna use a little bit of light blue. Just like that. And you remember, like what I said, just let it do its thing. Let it breathe. All right, I'm going to start filling in some of these other petals. Now, for my background, you might be wondering what I'm planning to do. I'm adding a little more blue down here. I am going to paint my background once this is all dry because I'm planning to use a salt technique, and I don't want to sprinkle salt over everything and have it get on my flowers too. I really just want that salt technique to be on the background. So when I post a picture of my final piece, you guys will see exactly what I am talking about. The last thing I'll say before I finish is I am starting to think a little bit about a light source. So this goes back to our previous unit, but I'm thinking about where things are gonna be lightest, okay, and where they're gonna be darkest. So the bottom of these petals, they're not facing my light source. My light source I've decided is up here. So I've decided that down in this part of my piece, that's where the most shading is gonna be, or the most value. The darkest parts of my painting. And then the lighter parts, which means adding more water, are gonna be up higher towards the light source, okay? So I'm gonna continue adding to this piece, but remember, watercolors are supposed to flow into one another. They're a very loose medium, and it's really relaxing to work with. So don't stress if things start to look a little bit messy. That's the whole beauty of watercolor paints.